Alright guys, we just got done putting the finishing touches on this World War inspired trench knife slash Bowie knife, and I really like how it turned out. I had a lot of fun making it and learned a lot in the process. I'm telling you, the military was onto something way to design these, because you just feel powerful when you hold it. It's awesome. Anyways, unlike most knives that I make, I actually didn't design this knife. My friend Jason with FargoFX designed this knife, and I designed him a knife to make on his channel. And I really wanted to do this collaboration with him because I really like how his channel set up and his content. And not only do collaborations benefit both YouTubers, but they benefit their audiences also. Because look, if you guys like my content at all, I really think you're gonna like his content. So there will be links in the description and in one of these corners to his channel. And I really suggest you guys go and check out his channel if you like my content at all. So without further ado, let's get on with the video. After I've cut out the blank from the 1095 steel with the angle grinder, I bring it over to my little belt sander. And although the angle grinder makes really quick work of cutting out metal, it leaves a pretty rough surface and it's not very accurate. And that's where the belt grinder comes in. It refines the shape to where I need it to be. Now where the blade meets the guard needs to be perfectly flat, so I bring a straight edge over, scribe a line in there, and then file down to it. In order to grind a nice even bevel, I coat the edge in paint and then use a drill bit that's the same width as the metal to scribe a line, and that's going to be pretty much dead on in the center of the metal. Then I grind up to that line, leaving about 1 millimeter of metal there, so that way it doesn't melt off or warp in heat treatment. Now I also filed in a secondary bevel on the top of the knife. It doesn't really have too much of a purpose besides making the edge pointier, but it looks cool, and that's the main reason why we did it. And I used a file because I wasn't confident that I wouldn't mess it up on the belt grinder. Next we need to harden the blade. So to do that, I heat up first a piece of rebar and warm up the oil that way. Then I heat up the knife red hot and quench it in that warm oil. That way it doesn't shock it. And that basically hardens the knife. You can hear that it is harder than a file, which is good. Now, next we're going to temper it, and I grind off one bevel so I can see the true color of the metal, and I put it in the oven at 400 degrees for 2 hours, let it rest, and then do another round at 400 degrees for 2 hours, and that softens the knife a bit. Then I made this cardboard guard, which allows me to see how much rebar I need to hammer out. I started off by flattening out the top of the guard, and I really just wasn't getting the metal as hot as I should have, so I moved up in hammer sizes. I got the top done and started working on the body. Then I noticed they weren't exactly perpendicular to each other. So I ran into the garage, clamped it in the vise, and tried to square it up that way, but it decided to just rotate in that vise. So I kind of got frustrated and I cut it off from the rest of the rebar and decided to work on the bottom of the guard. And that was a little bit easier because it's a smaller piece of metal. I found the best way to square up metal for me was to just grab 2 pairs of pliers and go ahead and bend them how I wanted it to be. So after I had everything flattened out, I went ahead and ground not only the scale that built up on there, but I also ground the edges from the rebar off, that way it looks halfway smooth. Next, I'm going to bend over the top of our guard with a piece of wood rather than a hammer, because the hammer would just mar up the surface that we worked so hard to make smooth. I'm going to do that on the bottom also, but it wasn't hot at first. Eventually we got it, and I decided I wanted to round the outside of the guard, and I used the horn of my anvil for that. But of course, when we round the part that was originally straight, that messes up our angles with the top and bottom of the guard. So it was a lot of just heating up and adjusting minutely, and then messing it up and adjusting it again. And I found one way that worked pretty well is to clamp it in a vise, heat it up, and then bend it with some vice grips. After that, I ground all the scale off once again with the belt sander. Now I couldn't quite get to the inside with the belt grinder, so I went ahead and cleaned it up with a half round file. Next, we need to make the holes in the top and the bottom of the guard to fit our knife in. So I used a center punch to center punch some holes along the line that was pretty much central to the guard. And then I drilled some holes and cleaned it out with a set of needle files. Once the top hole is finished, I repeated the process on the bottom of the guard. Then I drew out some knuckles on the outside of the guard and ground those off with the angle grinder. Then I took it over to the belt grinder to clean everything up, and I didn't get this on film, but then I put it in the oven at 470 until it turned a nice golden color. Then I took a piece of oak, I believe, and drew out where the tang of the knife would go, and then drew a handle around that and chopped it out with a bandsaw. Now this first piece is a pretty thick piece, and I cut out a second piece to match the first piece, but it was about half the size. Now on the thicker piece, I traced out where the tang will go. Then I used my Dremel to grind out a cavity where the tang can slide in and out of. So here you can see the handle basically sandwiches the tang inside the guard, and then I'll go ahead and glue those two pieces together so we basically have a wooden tube that the tang can slide in and out of. Then comes one of the most dreaded parts of knife making, and that's hand sanding. It takes a while, but it looks nice in the end. I like to use some WD-40 as a lubricant, and then I have a 120 grit belt underneath an old planer blade. I go with the grain as if it's a piece of wood to start off with. That way I can see what exactly the blades are looking like after heat treatment. Once that's done, I start skewing the scratch marks to the right or left. It doesn't really matter. And then after I do that for about 5 or 10 minutes, I look at the blade, and you'll see there are still scratch marks going parallel to the blade, and we don't want that. So we're going to go ahead and sand those out until all the scratch marks are going to the right or left, whichever one you choose. After about 3 hours working on the faces of the blade, I began working on the bevels. Now with the bevels, there's already scratch marks going perpendicular to the blade, so we just go with the grain on the bevels. And on the secondary bevel, on the top of the blade, remember I used a half round file to scratch that out, so I'm using a round piece of wood with a 120 grit belt on to sand that. That way it matches the contour of the blade. About 5 hours later, we're finally ready to finish up the blade. Now notice I don't have anything on the bottom side of the blade. That way nothing can get underneath it and scratch it. So to finish off blades, I put some WD-40 on there, and then I work from the base all the way to the tip in one motion. I don't go back and forth because at some point those little granules on the sandpaper have to turn around, and it makes sort of like little scribbles on the blade, and we don't want that. We just want one line continuing from the bottom to the top of the blade. I kind of forgot about the spine of the knife, but that's no big deal. I just went back in there with the round piece of wood once again to match the rounding contour of the spine. Now it's finally time to start preparing for the glue up. I make some notches with hacksaw on the tang, that way the epoxy has something to grab onto. But before we glue everything up, I clean up all the metal parts with some mineral spirits, and that's going to get rid of any grease or oil left on there. That way the epoxy bonds right onto the metal. I'm using some 2-part epoxy from Harbor Freight, and epoxy is great because it's just a really strong glue. Once I mix it up, I feed some into the hole in our handle, then I match the handle up with a guard, put some glue on the tang, and then feed the tang through the guard into the handle and out the other side, and then we clamp it up. For the finishing touch, I wrap the handle in some leather that I got. As usual, I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to leather wrap, so I'm not going to try to teach you guys, but there's a bunch of great tutorials out on YouTube if you're interested. That's what it looks like in the end, and I'm going to peen over the edge of the tang that's sticking out of the guard. That way it'll lock the blade into the guard and it won't move anywhere. So once again, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to check out FargoFX's channel, and I'll see you guys in my next video.